This photo of Ringling Brothers performers seems innocent until you notice the chains. In 1921, 12 circus artists posed outside their winter quarters in Wisconsin, celebrating what they called Annual Contract Renewal Day. At first glance, it looked like a joyful family gathering, performers in sequined costumes and feathered headdresses beaming at the camera with genuine smiles. But when museum curator Dr. Evelyn Harwick examined the photograph more closely in 2019, she discovered something disturbing. Those decorative chains weren't costume pieces. They showed real wear and tarnish. And they connected to actual shackles around the performers' ankles, partially hidden beneath elaborate outfits. The chains were real. The celebration wasn't what it seemed. These weren't happy employees. They were trapped performers whose debts kept growing no matter how hard they worked. How many families were imprisoned behind the circus's cheerful facade? And what really happened on Contract Renewal Day? If this story has sparked your interest in the hidden truths of history, consider subscribing to our channel to help keep hidden histories alive. And comment your city and local time. We're interested to know how far these documented accounts travel. The autumn morning of October 15, 2019, began like any other at the Circus World Museum in Baraboo, Wisconsin, where Dr. Evelyn Harwick had spent the better part of 3 decades cataloging the remnants of America's most celebrated entertainment empire. The museum's climate-controlled archives held thousands of photographs, contracts, and promotional materials that told the sanitized story of circus life, a carefully curated narrative of glamour, adventure, and the pursuit of the American dream. But on this particular morning, as she opened the final crate from the estate of Cornelius Whitmore, a former Ringling Brothers publicity manager who had died 6 months earlier, Dr. Harwick would discover that some photographs tell stories their creators never intended to preserve. Whitmore's donation had arrived with little fanfare, accompanied only by a brief note from his nephew, explaining that the old man had spent his final years obsessively organizing his circus materials, muttering about setting the record straight before his death. The first several boxes contained typical promotional materials, glossy images of death-defying trapeze artists, strong men lifting impossible weights, and exotic performers in elaborate costumes designed to transport audiences to distant, mysterious lands. These were the images that had sold millions of tickets and cemented the circus's reputation as America's greatest show, each photograph carefully staged to emphasize wonder, excitement, and the promise that ordinary people could witness extraordinary feats. It was nearly noon when Dr. Harwick encountered the photograph that would consume the next 4 years of her life. Unlike the polished promotional images that had come before, this particular photograph possessed an unsettling quality that made her pause. 12 performers stood arranged in 2 neat rows outside what appeared to be the circus's winter quarters. Their faces turned toward the camera with expressions that seemed almost too perfect, too uniformly joyful. The handwritten caption, penned in Whitmore's distinctive script, read simply, "Annual Contract Renewal Day, 1921, Winter Quarters, Baraboo." At first examination, the image appeared to capture exactly what its caption suggested, a celebration of mutual satisfaction between performers and management. The figures wore their finest stage costumes, creating a tableau of exotic glamour that spoke to the circus's international appeal. In the front row, a massive Italian strongman named Giuseppe Rossini stood beside a Polish family identified in pencil notations as the Kowalskis, Father Stanisław, Mother Magdalena, and their 3 children. Behind them, a Syrian acrobat named Hassan al-Mansouri posed next to several other performers, including a teenage girl whose elaborate rope-walking costume marked her as one of the circus's featured aerial acts. Their smiles seemed genuine, their posture confident, suggesting performers who had found prosperity and security within the circus family. But Dr. Harwick's trained eye, honed by decades of examining historical photographs for evidence of stories that subjects and photographers alike had tried to conceal, began to notice details that transformed celebration into something far more disturbing. Several performers wore what appeared to be decorative chains as part of their elaborate costumes, delicate metalwork that caught the light and added an exotic touch to their theatrical appearances. Yet these chains showed signs of wear and tarnish that seemed inconsistent with stage props, which were typically maintained in pristine condition for repeated performances under bright lights. More troubling still, the chains appeared to connect to metal objects around the performers' ankles, partially obscured by costume elements, but visible enough to suggest they were not merely decorative accessories. While most of the figures displayed the broad, theatrical smiles expected in promotional photography, 3 performers in the back row exhibited what Dr. Harwick recognized from her studies of historical labor documentation as expressions of resigned despair, the 1,000-yard stare of individuals who had learned to mask suffering behind socially acceptable facades. As she examined the photograph with a magnifying glass, cross-referencing it against the accompanying documents from Whitmore's collection, Dr. Harwick began to understand that annual contract renewal day represented something entirely different from the celebration its caption suggested. Hidden within Whitmore's meticulously organized files, she discovered contracts, financial ledgers, and correspondence that revealed the photograph as evidence of a sophisticated system of exploitation that had trapped entire families in cycles of debt that grew larger with each passing year, regardless of how faithfully they performed or how desperately they worked to satisfy their obligations. The chains in the photograph were not costume pieces designed to enhance theatrical illusion. They were instruments of control, justified in circus management documents as security devices, necessary to prevent performers from abandoning their contractual obligations and leaving management responsible for unpaid advances. The smiles that had initially appeared genuine now revealed themselves as masks worn by individuals who understood that their survival depended on maintaining the fiction of their contentment, even as they posed for a photograph that would serve as evidence of their captivity for anyone with the knowledge and courage to look closely enough to see the truth hidden in plain sight. Dr. Harwick's investigation began in earnest the following morning, as she spread Whitmore's documents across 3 library tables in the museum's research room, creating a timeline that would reveal the systematic nature of what she was beginning to understand as institutionalized exploitation disguised as entertainment employment. The contracts hidden within standard circus hiring paperwork told a story of financial entrapment so sophisticated that it could only have been designed by individuals who understood both legal loopholes and human psychology well enough to create documents that appeared legitimate while ensuring permanent bondage for those desperate enough to sign them. The 1921 contracts revealed a system where performers received what management termed advances for every aspect of their circus employment, costumes at inflated prices that would have purchased entire wardrobes in local stores, equipment that performers were required to maintain themselves despite paying rental fees, housing consisting of shared canvas accommodations that cost more per month than decent boarding houses in nearby towns, food described as premium circus meals that consisted primarily of bologna and beans, and medical care charged at hospital rates despite being provided by a single circus doctor whose primary qualification appeared to be his willingness to ask no questions about the injuries he treated or the working conditions that caused them. Most insidious were the fines imposed for infractions that ranged from legitimate performance issues to violations so vague that management could apply them at will: $5 for missed rehearsals, $10 for unsatisfactory performance, $15 for disrupting harmony among circus family members, and $50 for attempting to leave before contract completion. These were enormous sums when performers earned only $8 to $12 weekly, and the contract specified that all fines would be added to existing debt balances with interest compounding monthly, ensuring that even the most dedicated performers would find their obligations growing rather than diminishing over time. The complete file of the Kowalski family provided the most detailed example of how the system operated in practice. Stanisław and Magdalena Kowalski had arrived from Poland in 1919 with their 3 children, seeking the American prosperity that circus recruiters had promised would reward their strong backs and willingness to work. Their initial contract showed a $200 advance for family establishment costs, money they had never actually received in cash but which appeared on their account as debt for processing fees, transportation from Ellis Island, and integration assistance. That consisted of a single meeting with a Polish-speaking performer who explained the basic rules of circus life. By 1921, despite 2 years of faithful performances that had never earned them a single complaint from management or audiences, their debt had grown to $847. Dr. Harwick found desperate letters from Stanisław to circus management, written in broken English with the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to read and write as an adult, pleading to understand how their debt kept increasing despite their complete compliance with every contract requirement. The responses from Charles Weatherford, a Ringling Brothers executive, were masterpieces of corporate manipulation that acknowledged Stanisław's concerns while explaining that additional expenses had been incurred for services that the family had never requested and benefits they had never received. Through accounting ledgers that Whitmore had preserved with the obsessive thoroughness of a man who understood he was documenting crimes, Dr. Harwick discovered the daily reality of performer exploitation. Families were charged $3 daily for meals that cost the circus less than 50 cents to provide, $2 for tent accommodations that housed multiple families in spaces barely suitable for storing equipment, and $5 monthly for costume maintenance that performers were required to perform themselves using materials purchased at circus-inflated prices. Medical care for injuries sustained during performances, injuries that were inevitable given the dangerous nature of circus acts performed without adequate safety equipment, was charged at rates that exceeded those of the finest hospitals, plus additional transportation fees for the circus doctor who lived on the grounds and whose only travel consisted of walking from his tent to wherever treatment was needed. Most shocking to Dr. Harwick were the contract clauses requiring performers to wear security devices during travel and public appearances, language that transformed literal shackles into legal requirements justified as preventing loss of circus property and ensuring that performers could not abandon their contractual obligations without proper notification and debt settlement. The chains visible in the photograph were not merely symbolic of economic bondage. They were actual restraints whose use was legitimized through legal language that portrayed human beings as property whose movement required control and whose freedom posed a threat to business operations. These documents revealed that the 1921 photograph captured not a celebration but a ritual of renewed captivity, where performers learned whether their debts had increased enough to trap them for another year, and where the chains they wore served as both literal restraints and visible reminders that their bodies belonged to the circus until their obligations were satisfied, obligations designed never to be satisfied as long as the performers remained useful to management's financial interests. Dr. Harwick's breakthrough came 3 months into her investigation, when her efforts to locate descendants of the performers in the photograph led her to a modest apartment building on Chicago's Northwest Side, where Amelia Rossini lived surrounded by carefully preserved family photographs and documents that her grandfather had instructed her to guard with her life. Amelia, a retired librarian in her 70s whose methodical nature had been shaped by decades of cataloging other people's stories, had spent 40 years wondering whether the family materials her grandfather Giuseppe had entrusted to her care would ever serve the purpose he had intended when he pressed them into her teenage hands shortly before his death in 1934. Giuseppe Rossini's secret diary, written in Italian and hidden for decades because Nonno said the circus people would hurt us if they knew he wrote down the truth, provided the first unfiltered account of daily life behind the cheerful facade that circus management had worked so carefully to maintain. The leather-bound journal, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of a man who understood that his words might be the only evidence that would survive to tell their story, revealed systematic cruelty that transformed every aspect of performers' lives into opportunities for financial exploitation and psychological control. Giuseppe had written with the precision of someone who knew that his testimony might be challenged, recording specific dates, exact amounts, and direct quotes from conversations with both management and fellow performers. His entry from March 12, 1921, described an incident that illustrated the arbitrary nature of the punishment system. They tell us we are family, but familia does not chain their children. Today, little Petra Svoboda tried to run when her papa was sick with fever and could not perform. They caught her at the train station before she could buy a ticket to Chicago. Now her debt is $300 more, and they make her wear the ankle chains even during performance so all can see what happens to those who try to leave. She is only 14 years old and cries every night, but quietly, so management cannot add fine for disturbing other performers' rest. The diary revealed an underground network of performers who secretly aided each other despite the risk of severe punishment if their mutual assistance was discovered by management. Giuseppe described how performers with smaller debts would accidentally drop coins near the quarters of newcomers whose debt loads made it impossible to purchase even basic necessities, how they created coded warning systems to alert each other when circus executives were approaching their living areas, and how they shared information about contract terms and legal rights despite management's efforts to keep performers ignorant of their actual legal standing. Hassan al-Mansouri, the Syrian acrobat whose dignified bearing had caught Dr. Harwick's attention in the photograph, had taught basic English legal terminology to other performers during late-night gatherings hidden from management oversight, hoping that knowledge might provide some protection against the worst forms of exploitation. Most heartbreaking were Giuseppe's descriptions of children born at the circus who were automatically enrolled as apprentice performers, with their own debt accounts beginning at birth. These second-generation captives were charged for their delivery by the circus doctor, their feeding and housing from infancy, and their training in circus skills, whether or not they showed any aptitude or interest in performance. Giuseppe's entry from August 5, 1922, captured the horror of this inherited bondage. The babies cannot choose, but their chains are already forged before they take first breath. Little Maria Kowalski is now 2 years old and owes circus $43 for her life so far. When she learns to walk on rope like her mama wants, the debt will grow for costume and equipment and training. When she falls and hurts herself, debt will grow for medical care. There is no end to what they can charge, and no beginning to when the charges stop. Dr. Harwick's search for contemporary witnesses led her to Helen Svoboda Patterson, Petra's niece, now 89 years old, and living in a Chicago nursing home where her sharp memory and direct manner preserved family stories that official documents could never capture. Helen confirmed the brutal reality that Giuseppe's diary had recorded. Aunt Petra never spoke much about the circus years, said it was too painful to remember, but I could see the scars around her ankles until the day she died. She told me once that they said the chains were for safety, to keep her from falling during performances, but she knew better. They were punishment for trying to escape, and warning to others about what happened when you didn't accept your place. Helen's testimony provided crucial details about how Petra had finally achieved freedom in 1924, when a circus customer, moved by her obvious distress during a performance, had offered to pay off her debt as part of a marriage proposal that represented her only legal escape from bondage. She married him not for love but for freedom, Helen explained, and she used to say that was the smartest business decision she ever made, even though it took her years to learn how to sleep without chains around her ankles. Dr. Harwick's investigation expanded beyond the Ringling brothers when she began discovering identical contract systems and debt bondage practices across the entire American circus industry, revealing a coordinated conspiracy that stretched from the largest entertainment corporations to the smallest traveling shows that crisscrossed rural America throughout the early decades of the 20th century. Archives at Barnum and Bailey, Cole Brothers, and dozens of smaller operations contained virtually identical contract language, suggesting that circus owners had collaborated to create standardized systems of exploitation that prevented performers from seeking better opportunities elsewhere, no matter how desperate their circumstances became or how willing they were to accept dangerous working conditions in exchange for basic human dignity. The evidence of industry-wide coordination emerged through correspondence between circus executives that Whitmore had apparently collected as insurance against potential legal challenges to his own role in maintaining the system. A 1920 letter from Ringling Brothers executive Charles Weatherford to competitor Theodore Blackstone read with chilling directness, "Our mutual prosperity depends on maintaining proper performer discipline across all operations. We must standardize contract terms and enforcement mechanisms to prevent performers from seeking what they might perceive as better opportunities with rival organizations. The success of our business model requires that no circus offer significantly different terms, as this would undermine the foundation upon which we have built our industry's profitability." Court records revealed how circuses exploited legal gray areas around entertainment contracts and artistic apprenticeships that provided them with protections unavailable to traditional employers, while simultaneously denying performers the rights typically afforded to employees in other industries. When performers attempted to sue for wages or challenge their working conditions, circus lawyers successfully argued that their clients were willing participants in specialized training programs rather than employees deserving of standard labor protections. Local politicians receiving generous donations during election seasons and complimentary tickets for their families and political supporters rarely intervened when presented with evidence of performer mistreatment, often dismissing complaints as misunderstandings between foreign immigrants and their American employers. Dr. Harwick discovered that several judges in Wisconsin, Illinois, and Florida held direct financial interests in circus operations through stock investments that created obvious conflicts of interest when performer lawsuits reached their courtrooms. Judge Harold Morrison of the Wisconsin 3rd District Court, who had dismissed at least 7 performer lawsuits between 1918 and 1924, owned shares in Ringling Brothers worth approximately $3,000, nearly 10 times his annual judicial salary, and a fortune that depended directly on the continued profitability of the exploitation system he was tasked with potentially dismantling through legal remedy. The publicity machine that maintained the circus's wholesome image represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up, transforming systematic abuse into heartwarming stories of immigrant success and artistic dedication that newspapers across the country reprinted without investigation. Press releases emphasized performer loyalty and dedication, describing multi-year contracts as evidence of mutual satisfaction rather than legal bondage, while carefully scripted interviews with selected performers provided testimonials about circus life that bore no resemblance to the reality documented in private correspondence and financial records. Reporters were given access only to performers whose debt loads were manageable and who understood that negative comments would result in immediate punishment, ensuring that published accounts reinforced rather than challenged the fiction of circus benevolence. Perhaps most disturbing was Dr. Harwick's discovery of correspondence between circus medical staff and major universities, revealing how trapped performers were used as subjects for medical experiments that would have been impossible to conduct on patients who possessed the freedom to refuse treatment or seek second opinions. A 1921 letter from circus Dr. Marcus Cornelius to researchers at Johns Hopkins described unique opportunities to study the effects of repetitive physical stress on human anatomy using subjects who are available for extended observation periods and follow-up examinations. The performers, unable to leave their contracts and lacking access to alternative medical care, became unwilling participants in studies that examined everything from bone density changes caused by repeated high-impact landings to the psychological effects of chronic pain on cognitive function. The international trafficking component of the system emerged through immigration records that showed how circuses recruited performers from Europe and Asia with promises of American opportunities, then confiscated passports upon arrival and deliberately allowed temporary visas to expire, creating stateless persons who faced deportation if they attempted to leave their circus employment. Giuseppe Rossini's diary contained references to performers from at least 12 countries who had arrived legally but found themselves trapped within American borders without proper documentation, dependent on circus management for the legal protection that allowed them to remain in the country while simultaneously preventing them from seeking employment elsewhere or accessing government services that might have provided assistance. These recruiting operations specifically targeted families in desperate circumstances, offering passage to America and guaranteed employment to heads of households who lacked the education or language skills necessary to understand the true terms of the agreements they were signing. The system created a renewable supply of vulnerable workers whose foreign birth, limited English, and precarious legal status made them unlikely to seek help from authorities who might not understand their cultural backgrounds, and would certainly lack sympathy for immigrants who appeared to have voluntarily entered into contractual relationships with American businesses. Dr. Harwick's investigation culminated in 2023 when her comprehensive documentation of America's circus debt bondage system prompted congressional hearings that finally provided official recognition for a systematic exploitation that had trapped thousands of performers and their families across multiple generations. Her evidence, published in a landmark report titled "The Chains Behind the Smiles: Human Trafficking in American Entertainment 1900 to 1950," contained irrefutable proof that the nation's most beloved entertainment industry had operated an extensive network of forced labor that would have been immediately recognizable as slavery if its victims had not been white Europeans and Middle Easterners whose foreign origins made their suffering easier for American authorities to ignore or dismiss. Through death certificates, immigration records, and interviews with descendants, Dr. Harwick had traced the ultimate fate of each performer visible in the 1921 photograph, creating individual narratives that transformed statistical evidence into human stories that legislators and journalists could not ignore. Giuseppe Rossini had died in 1934 at age 47, still technically owing the circus $236, despite 14 years of faithful service that had generated thousands of dollars in revenue for management. His death certificate listed the cause as heart failure, but his granddaughter Amelia possessed medical records suggesting that decades of physical stress combined with chronic malnutrition had contributed to his early death, making him as much a victim of systematic exploitation as if he had been killed by more direct violence. The Kowalski family had finally achieved freedom in 1925 when Stanisław suffered a career-ending back injury during a rehearsal accident and was released from his contract to avoid the medical expenses that would have been required for his treatment and rehabilitation. Their debt at the time of his discharge was over $1,000, but circus management chose to absorb the loss rather than support a disabled performer who could no longer generate revenue. Stanisław never fully recovered from his injury and spent his remaining years working in Chicago factories while struggling with chronic pain that prevented him from ever again earning the wages that might have provided his family with economic security. Petra Svoboda's escape through marriage in 1924 had saved her life, but the psychological trauma of her circus years had lasted until her death in 1978. Her medical records, shared by her niece Helen with Dr. Harwick's research, documented decades of nightmares, anxiety attacks, and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from her years of captivity. She had never been able to watch circus performances and would leave movie theaters if circus scenes appeared on screen, unable to separate the entertainment spectacle from her memories of systematic abuse disguised as show business. The most remarkable discovery was that Hassan al-Mansouri, the Syrian acrobat whose legal knowledge had made him a crucial figure in the underground resistance network, had not only survived his circus captivity, but had become a legal advocate for immigrant performers after gaining his freedom in 1926. His self-taught understanding of American contract law, combined with his first-hand experience of systematic exploitation, had made him invaluable to other immigrants seeking to escape similar situations in circuses, traveling shows, and other entertainment enterprises that targeted vulnerable foreign workers. Hassan's grandson, Dr. Ahmad al-Mansouri, now a prominent civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., had worked closely with Dr. Harwick to ensure that her research reached policymakers who possessed the authority to provide meaningful accountability for historical injustices. My grandfather always said that the truth would eventually surface, Dr. al-Mansouri explained during his testimony before Congress. He kept his circus contract until the day he died, saying it was evidence that America could do terrible things, but that Americans could also fight to make them right. He taught me that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied, as long as someone remembers and someone cares enough to speak for those who were silenced. The institutional response to Dr. Harwick's findings exceeded her expectations, as organizations that had benefited from circus-generated tourism revenue and cultural prominence began acknowledging their indirect complicity in systematic exploitation. The Smithsonian Institution revised its circus exhibitions to include detailed information about the debt bondage system, while Ringling Brothers and Barnum & Bailey, which had ceased operations in 2017, issued a formal corporate apology acknowledging that historical labor practices employed by our predecessor organizations failed to meet any reasonable standard of human dignity and fair employment. And we deeply regret the suffering inflicted upon performers and their families who sought only the opportunity to work honestly in pursuit of American dreams. The legislative outcome of these revelations was the Performers Protection Act, passed by Congress in 2023, which established a federal compensation fund for descendants of entertainment workers who had been subjected to debt bondage, forced labor, or other systematic exploitation between 1900 and 1950. While monetary compensation could not undo generations of suffering, the legislation provided official acknowledgement that the United States government recognized these historical injustices and accepted responsibility for ensuring that similar exploitation could never again operate with legal protection. The Circus World Museum now displays the 1921 photograph alongside Giuseppe's diary, The Kowalski Family Contracts, and Dr. Harwick's Complete Research Archive. A placard beside the exhibition reads, "This image reminds us that behind celebrated American institutions often lay hidden systems of exploitation that transformed dreams into nightmares for those least able to defend themselves." The performers' smiles masked a reality of debt bondage that trapped families for generations, but their courage in preserving evidence of their suffering ultimately brought truth to light and justice to their memory.